was more or less right, although I probably should have left collision resistance out of it. So Jeremy pointed out that, so hang on, let me just summarize what we were talking about. We were talking about this hashing here. And we were talking about like what happens if your hash function is broken, right? So first of all, we know that it's proven secure in the random oracle model. So in a sense, if we have this sort of perfect idealized hash function, then it's secure. And I was talking about collision resistance, although probably that was a distraction. And I was saying, look, if you can get a collision, specifically if you can get a collision with a valid proof, then you can kind of use the other part of your collision to generate a fake proof, which I think is probably still true. Although strictly speaking, I probably should have said second pre-image resistance rather than collision resistance, right? Because you kind of want your first proof to be a real thing that you made honestly. And then Jeremy said, well, the Schnorr proof is proven secure using only pre-image resistance. So what's going on here? And for some reason, everybody got confused, and it was clear that everybody needed to go and have a coffee, because actually all of these things are entirely consistent, right? Pre-image resistance is actually a weaker property than either second pre-image resistance or collision resistance. So actually all of these things are entirely consistent, right? If we assume collision resistance, then that implies pre-image resistance, or to put it the other way around, if you can compute pre-images efficiently, then you can certainly compute collisions efficiently. Okay, so I did actually try and dig myself out of the hole that I dug myself and try and figure out exactly how you can use your second pre-image to break it. But I don't think I'll inflict it upon you, although I might try and put it together for the notes. But bottom line is, we all agree that it's proven secure in the random oracle model. Jeremy's remarked that the Schnorr protocol is proven secure under pre-image resistance. I 100% believe, and am very willing to believe, that it applies here, although I don't know the specific proof, but it seems very plausible. And then all of that is entirely consistent with the idea that, as Orr and I were discussing, you could, if you can brute force the thing in such a way that you can generate a clash with the right form, then you can break it. Does anyone else who thought about it through the break want to add anything else? No stunning silence. Anybody want to ask a question? Other thoughts?
Felix wrote a comment on Zulip over the break. He says, it looks like a random collision's not sufficient. As the prover calculates an exponent of G in the last message, this has to cancel out the exponent sent in the first message. So if the prover uses a collision, they need to know the discrete log of the two elements which collide to then compensate for them in the last message. However, I'm not sure about this reasoning. So
yes, that is a very, very good point. You are absolutely right. And so I think what you would have to do, if you were doing this brute force thing where you try to generate collisions, I think what you would have to do is you'd have to brute force your way through the space in such a way that you knew the discrete logs of the things that you were finding collisions of. So in particular, rather than generating, you know, A, B, C, D, E, F, G in the space and then trying to hash them, I think you would want to generate G to the A, G to the B, G to the C in the space, and then see if they collided. And so then when you found a collision, you'd know what the discrete log of your collision was. So yes, sounds like you figured out the right thing during the break. Did you actually get all the way through to faking a proof? Because if you did, I would love you to write it up for everybody else. Okay, I can't see an answer, but that's okay. Maybe they're just coming back from break. So, okay, this, it turns out, is actually very relevant to the thing I was actually intending to talk about, which was the breaking the Swiss e-voting system. Now, it's not quite the same because breaking the Swiss e-voting system does not require breaking the hash, but it does require, doesn't require breaking the hash function, but it does require kind of mucking around with the intended order of the way these proofs are supposed to be generated. So I would like to get you to download, not the final version of our paper, but a kind of earlier version that we wrote with a simpler and more detailed explanation of how to break this particular thing. We might come back to the disjunctive proofs at the end. Okay, go to this URL and download this version of the paper, which is a very preliminary version of the paper that of which there is a lot more detail in this year's Oakland. I quit uni years ago, not years ago, months ago, but they still haven't taken down my website yet. So hope everybody can go there, download that thing, and then we're going to look at the paper. Okay, I'm changing. All right. So let's just come back for a second to CGS. You'll see that, so remembering that Helios generates its challenge by hashing these A and B values. In the Helios context, the prover does not get the opportunity to generate the ciphertext, right? So the ciphertext is these XY values up here. And so hashing just A and B is secure. It's fine. Now, it turns out in the Swiss Post context, the person generating the proof also has the opportunity to generate the incoming ciphertext. And in that context, we actually need to hash more than just these A and B values. Because if you can hash A and B and then do some stuff and then generate X and Y for yourself after you've generated the proof, this turns out to be trouble. All right, so I hope everybody has got this now. Sorry, there's a lot of other guff about how the Swiss e-voting system worked, which we're going to leave out. So just as a little recap, the Swiss electronic voting system had a bunch of uses of this kind of cryptography, actually. One of which was a very fancy shuffle proof that was also broken that I'm not going to talk about, although it's also kind of interesting. But the crucial point that we're going to think about this being used is the case in which the decryption service decrypts a vote and proves that they did so correctly with their secret key. So the assumption is the verifier knows the ciphertext, obviously, the group parameters, and the public key that this decryption service is going to use. And then the decryption service is proving proper decryption using their secret key as that secret exponent alpha in the proof that we were just looking at. So that all sounds very fine. But it turns out that there's a weird kind of subtlety in the way that they decided to put this protocol together, which is that the authorities do kind of mixing and decryption at the same time. So there's a series of mix servers that shuffle the votes. I can't remember whether Jeremy did this yesterday. I assume he kind of basically did. The conceptual way that we usually think about this is that we have a series of mix servers that each shuffles and re-randomizes the vote. And then we have a collection of decryption servers, which each, perhaps in a distributed way, decrypt the output of the sequence of mixing servers. But that separation is not what they actually did in the Swiss Post and CITL system. They did this unusual kind of thing where each mix server kind of mixed, re-randomized, and then partially decrypted the sequence of the set of votes, and then passed it on to the next mix server who shuffled again, re-randomized again, and partially decrypted with their secret key, and so their private key, and so on. So the upshot of this is that the mix servers as a group, and particularly the last one, has the opportunity to produce, or at least influence, the ciphertext that they're proving decryption of, right? Because they're mixing and then they're decrypting. So it's not as simple as the Helios case, where the Helios server, decryption server, is directly decrypting a ciphertext that was just produced by homomorphic addition. It's actually a much more subtle and complicated situation where an untrusted decryption authority is proving correct decryption of a set of ciphertexts that they themselves have produced. And it turns out that the simple hashing thing that you saw is not secure in this setting. Okay, so let's look carefully at what is going on here. Now, I wonder if I can move this little window out of the way. Oh, yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I'm sorry to say I'm changing notation on you, which was not really the intention. But again, I guess the eventual intention is to help people be able to read both sets of papers. So I considered for a long time whether it was better to try and make the notation consistent or whether it was better to lead students into being able to read the paper. And I opted for the latter. Okay, so you can read the paper, but sadly, we've now got a slightly different set of notation. Okay. And we're going for, at least in this case, just the plain old version of El Gamal, where we have the message just in the group as a message M, not the exponential version where we had to G to the power of M like we did before. Okay, so PK is our public key. X is our secret key. And our ciphertext, we're going to call C0, C1, and it's going to be G to the R and then M times the public key to the power of R. And our proof of decryption, which I hope you figured out in the first hour, is the proof of this discrete logarithm relationship, where X is the secret exponent, and X is both, obviously, the discrete log of the public key to the base G, and it's also meant to be the discrete log of the second element of the ciphertext to the base consisting of the first element of the ciphertext. So this little expression on the end is just to say, if we're trying to prove that the decryption is something other than 1, then we just divide out the thing we're claiming that the message decrypts to. So the whole proof is a proof that the ciphertext is an encryption of 1. All right, so here's how Swiss Post's version of this proof worked. It's exactly what we were looking at before. So, except with a slight change in notation, I'm sorry to say. So we pick a random exponent. I think it was W in the Kramer-Gennaro Schoenmaker's paper. And we're supposed to raise both of the both x and y to this exponent. Then we hash some extra stuff, right? So you can see they're already a little bit aware that they're operating in a slightly different environment from the Helios environment. So we're not just hashing the A and B values, which correspond to the B0 and B1 values here. We're also hashing the second element of the ciphertext and the public key. And then we're doing exactly what we otherwise did in the proof that you saw in the first hour. And I might even be able to fit the verification equations on the screen. They're exactly the same as you saw before. Okay, so, and again, we verified both verification equations, and then we verified that the challenge has been properly computed through the hash. So this seems fine. But remember that our cheating prover is going to be trying to generate an input ciphertext C0, C1, or C0, C1 prime, I guess, that makes this work, even though it isn't true. Now, what's the first thing you notice about this hash? It isn't including a hash of C0, right? It's including a hash of C0 raised to some power, but it's C0 raised to a secret power that the prover hasn't really committed to yet. So this is the problem. And what we're going to do is step slowly through how a cheating prover can use this wiggle room to generate a completely false proof. Questions are welcome anytime as we go, by the way. If there are any questions in the chat, just yell out. Okay, so the problem is that we didn't hash C0, so we get to make up C0 afterwards. And here's how it works. So note, first of all, that we're going to use exactly the trick that the student whose name I've forgotten, sorry, mentioned as having figured out during the break. We're not just going to generate random stuff. We're going to generate random stuff in such a way that we know the discrete log of the random stuff we're generating. Okay, so here's how we're going to start. First of all, we're going to start by setting up our proof wrongly, right? We're supposed to generate a certain value A, and we're supposed to raise, let me show you what we were supposed to do again. We were supposed to raise both G0 and the first element of our ciphertext to the same exponent. But when we cheat, we're going to just generate a bunch of different random exponents that we know. And we're going to take our input values to be of that form rather than the nice form that they're supposed to have. So B0 is the thing it's supposed to be. C1 and B1 are just going to be random stuff we made up, but know the discrete log of. Then we compute the hash of that stuff, because that's really all that we can do. Then we compute the response to the challenge. And you can see this is a little bit like what you did in the first hour, where you were simulating the transcript without knowing the secret, right? You can compute a response that's consistent with what you knew. Because you know, we're assuming that the cheating decryption oracle knows the secret key X. You just computed C, you made up A, so you can certainly make this response work, at least for one of the verification equations, right? So going back up here, you will see we just forced the verification equation to be true for the B0 version, right? But now so we've got our hash. That's all good. We computed that more or less honestly. We've just computed Z, or Z if you prefer, in such a way that this verification equation is true. But now we're going to use our wiggle room, because we haven't actually committed to C0 yet. We're going to use our wiggle room to determine C0 after the fact to make this second verification equation true, even though the fact is not true. Okay. So once you look at it that way, it's actually pretty clear how to solve. And in fact, if I was a better lecturer, I would be able to fit that all onto one slide. Let me just see if we can do that. Oh, come on. Yay, okay, victory. All right. So in fact, really it's just linear algebra and just works out immediately. So you remember that all of this stuff in the exponent group is all, it's a prime order group. We know the order, it's Q. And so we can always invert in a group of that kind because we know that anything to the power of, anything to the power of Q minus 1 is just 1. So when we write divided by Z here, we can just invert that element in the exponent group very easily. And then we can just solve linear equations exactly, pretty much exactly as we would over the ordinary space of real numbers. So what we do is we simply solve this verification equation for C0 using the value of C1 prime that we already made up, the value of C that we got from our hash, and the value of Z that we just made up here. And we get that. And so now we go back to the public, the voting public, and we say, look, here's a ciphertext, and here's a truthful decryption of that ciphertext, except of course, our decryption is not at all truthful. It's just some other rubbish that we made up. So we've got our fake proof. We've got a little argument in the paper that this is highly likely to be fake and not not a coincidental resemblance to the truth. And then we just have to make, and then we can fit into our mixing and decryption proof just about any claimed message that we want. It turns out because of the way that it was all fitted together, the cheating prover actually doesn't have complete freedom to make up whatever they like. And so if you like, you can read the rest of the paper and see that they kind of have to fiddle with the rest of the mixing and decryption proof to make one particular value fit into the rest of their constraints. So even though you get through this proof and you can kind of choose basically any message that you like, it turns out that in order to be able to fit it into a plausible looking complete mixing and decryption proof, because they don't have complete freedom over the input ciphertext, they're kind of constrained to one particular message that makes another set of equations work, with the result that in the Swiss Post and CITL system, a cheating decryption authority could take a valid looking vote and use this cheat to generate a completely fake but passing proof that that valid vote decrypted to complete nonsense. They couldn't choose an alternative valid looking vote. That would have been disastrous, but they could produce a valid proof that the vote decrypted to rubbish that wouldn't be counted. All right, I'm going to pause there for questions because that's kind of the end of the main content of what I wanted to say.
I think everybody are already tired.
Everybody's exhausted.
I think Felix has just wrote something. Is it fixable by including C0 in the hash, or was it needed because?
Yes, absolutely. So that is exactly right. It is fixable by including C0 in the hash. And that is exactly the correct, fix is, gosh, you would think it would say here somewhere, wouldn't you? That is, anyway, that is exactly the correct fix to include C0. I think this particular version might be just saying how to break it, but yes, that's the fix. Is back here, they should be including C0 in the hash. And that fixes it completely. Now, it's worth pointing out that it only fixes it for an authority who cannot choose the Algamal parameters. So if you wanted to be really paranoid, or if you were using this in a scenario where the cheating authority also had the capacity to choose the group parameters, you would also want to hash the group parameters, because in a sense, that's a part of the statement as well, right? It's really about G, H, C0 and C1. We're assuming, I guess, if we're only hashing C0, then we're kind of assuming that the cheating authority can't choose G and the public key. If they can choose G and the public key, then G and the public key need to be in the hash as well.
So Jan is asking, why wasn't C0 included in the hash?
Because they adopted a framework due to Ulimara, which explicitly works in the non-adaptive setting, right? So Maura has this beautiful, very general framework for understanding and proving security properties of proofs of this form. And he proves that framework secure explicitly and correctly in the non-adaptive setting, right? But then they went and used it in the adaptive setting without fully realizing the implications of the prover being able to choose the input ciphertext. So they took this thing that is secure in the setting where the prover cannot choose the ciphertext, and then they used it in a setting where the prover can choose the ciphertext, and in that setting it is not secure.
Beside beheading them, what was done in Poland?
Sorry, speak up. Besides what?
I'm looking at the Zulik to see if there is any question. I don't see any.
All right, well, I've actually got much faster through what I was going to say. And now I wish I'd explained a little bit about the other problem with the shuffling proof, which was a problem associated with basically being able to open Peterson commitments using a trapdoor. But maybe everybody's had enough. So I might leave it there, unless there are more questions.
Just a quick question from Jan. Would the impact of this issue in the real elections be detectable?
Right, this is an excellent question. Okay, so the Swiss, the short answer is yes. It would be detectable, but it would pass verification. Okay, so there was a very explicit and clear and complete verification specification that was written for this system, and it explicitly dealt with the possibility that there might be invalid votes coming out of the end of the mixnet. And it sort of said, put them aside and think about them later. It did not say verification should fail if any invalid looking votes pop out. Although it's kind of clear if you read the rest of the system that there was nothing in the system that should have had the capacity to produce invalid votes. So it would have kind of been obvious that something had gone wrong, but it would have not been clear what had gone wrong, because it would have caused the system to enter a state that it wasn't ever supposed to be able to enter. And the verification specification was quite explicit in this case and said that verification should pass in this case, even though there was sort of an informal remark that said, you know, this isn't quite right, somebody should investigate, kind of thing. So we don't really know for sure whether people were explicitly checking for this case. The people running the formal verification specification were not explicitly checking for this case, and were not guaranteed to fail if it occurred. There has been some kind of informal discussion in Switzerland following on from that, where basically the people administering the election said they went back and tried to check to the extent that it was possible, and nobody saw any indication that this had happened. But we don't really know for sure how carefully they would have been checking for it at the time. We also don't really know what would have happened if it had occurred, right? Because although it would informally have been clear that something had gone wrong, it would not have been at all clear how. And in particular, it wouldn't have been at all clear. My guess is that suspicion probably would have been assumed to lie with the voters and the voting clients, rather than with the decryption service, if it ever had happened at all. So we're really not sure. Bear in mind also that in fact, the version that I've presented here was never used. So the version in which this proof gets used for decryption by a decryption authority was proposed for use 6 months into the future. The version that they had actually already been using did use this proof, which was broken, but they only used it in a related case in the voting client, where the voter was building a vote and proving that it had certain properties. And the implication of the bug in that instance was that the voter's client could build a proof that really was nonsense, but provide a passing proof that it was a valid vote, and then send that into the mix. So informally, something would have been apparently wrong, but they think that that didn't happen, although we're not certain how comprehensively they were testing for it.
There's a question from Felix. So the attack would include colluding voter to cast a bogus vote.
So 2 different attacks. Sorry, I should lay out the landscape a lot more clearly. There's actually 2 different uses of this proof in the Swiss e-voting system. One is at the client end, where the voter's computer generates a ballot and uses a Sean Peterson proof to prove that the ballot is valid. And that proof was also broken, and that would have allowed a cheating client to submit a vote that was not valid, get the right verification codes back, but and kind of convince the voter and the rest of the system that everything was okay, but actually submit an invalid vote that wouldn't be counted. And that had actually been used. And then the second and completely separate use of this same proof was in the decryption case that I've presented it here, in which it was the decryption authority who could cheat, but this version of the proof was never actually used. It was only proposed for use and was discontinued when we showed that it was broken. So the answer to your question is, can the decryption authority have cheated in this way without colluding with a voter. If you read a little bit further down in this paper, you will see that we outline a couple of different scenarios in which the cheating decryption authority can successfully go through with the whole attack. And the answer is they have to know a little bit more information about at least some things in order to fit it in to the mixing and decryption sequence, right? So this they don't need collusion with an actively malicious client that actively does anything wrong, but they do need some information leakage from the voting client to the cheating decryption server, basically just to get the algebra to work in exactly the way you're trying to fiddle with during the break, right? They need to know the randomness used to generate some of the ballots in order to successfully fiddle the ballot and make the fake decryption fit into the sequence.
And then the last question on here, regarding the other issue in the Swiss system, what about its impact? Would it be detectable?
No. Okay. So the other issue in the Swiss system was a break of the shuffling proof related to completely breaking the Peterson commitment implementation by using a trapdoor in the commitment. So a commitment scheme is meant to be a scheme that lets you publish a commitment and then sometime later open your commitment and reveal what you committed to. And the obvious definition of soundness in that case is that you shouldn't have a choice about opening it more than one different way. And yet the Peterson commitment implementation in the Swiss Post system was implemented in such a way that if you knew a trapdoor for the commitment parameters, you could very easily open any commitment any different way you liked. And this, crucially, was completely undetectable. So you could generate a perfectly convincing shuffle proof that produced entirely valid-looking ciphertexts and was completely indistinguishable from a truthful shuffle proof. So that also is in the Oakland paper, if you would like to look that up in any more detail. And that would not have been detectable at all. All right, if everybody's done, I will sign off. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody. And if you think of more questions that you'd like to ask, I hope you've all got my email address, vanessa@thinkingcybersecurity.com. And more questions are welcome. And otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow for the... I'm going to give a more general talk tomorrow about the kind of whole landscape of internet voting across the world with none of these technical details in it.